Hey, Jake Hansen's Custom Knives here. Today we're starting a pretty cool build, something a little bit different for me. I'm doing a Star Trek themed Klingon fighting blade for fellow creator and pretty cool guy, Alex Hollings. He does a lot of really cool aviation stuff. I'm a big aviation nerd, so I've been following him for a while. Reached out to me and asked me to do something a little bit different than what I normally do, but something I'm pretty interested in doing, more of an art style knife. I've been wanting to kind of do some of these, really push some of my fine detail work. So let's get into it, and we're going to start the blade today. I'm going to use my laser to help me align everything properly on this. I scribed a line down the center of the billet, and then I used that center line to align everything to make sure it was nice and square. And then I'm going to use the laser to outline my design. Again, make sure everything's really nice and symmetrical. Because it's a dagger, everything needs to be really symmetrical or it's going to look way off. I've been using the laser more and more for patterns and things like that, and it works out really well. So the reason I needed to use the laser to make sure everything was nice and parallel on the billet was because I'm going to mill out the center slot on this. Because I have that center line drawn, I'm going to be able to use a chamfering bit in the mill. I use this because it's got a nice point on it, and I'll be able to center that on that line so that when I go to mill in the cutout, it's going to be perfectly aligned with the center of that blade. So then I need to swap the chuck out, and I'm going to put in a collet that will hold my 1/4 inch end mill that I'm going to use to cut the slot. Just a pretty standard carbide end mill, 1/4 inch, and I think this one's a 6 flute, but it's not really what you need, it's just what I had. Next part is pretty simple. We're just going to do our plunge cut through here. This is a 3/16 inch thick piece of steel. It's not too much work for this little mill. I've just got a Grizzly mini mill here. Probably maxing things out a little bit as far as doing a 3/16 inch lateral cut on here. But just take my time, and it works out pretty well. Towards the end of the cut, I started getting a little more chatter, and I noticed that things were heating up a little bit too much. So just a little compressed air here from the air compressor to help bring chips out and cool things down a little bit. And I was able to finish out those cuts pretty easily. Pretty simple, no surprises on this one, and everything came out pretty well. You also notice here that I ended up re-lasering that in a different position so that I could have a longer tang for this design. Over on the metal cutting bandsaw, I'm going to just start rough profiling this out, and then I'll get ready to take it over to the grinder. I'm going to start out using my small wheel attachment to grind out the curved portions of this blade. You could do this on a flat platen and get pretty close, but I find because of that nice even curve that I want here, and again trying to make everything super symmetrical, this is the way to go. It also saves me a lot later on hand sanding and shaping. Then for the flat sections where I want things to be nice and straight and parallel, I'm going to move over to my flat platen, and that's going to help me keep that line. Sometimes the small wheel attachment can kind of give you a ripple if it's a real flat section. As the belt kind of bites, it digs in and makes a pretty uneven surface sometimes without a lot of effort. With all the rough profiling done, it's time to do some heat treat, so we're going to put it in at 1500 degrees and get ready to do our quench. I'll usually let this soak at that temperature for about 10 minutes to make sure it's thoroughly heated all the way through. When I pull this out, you can see there's a nice even color all the way through the blade, which means I have a good even temperature, and then we're going to quench it in some Parks 50. Everything came out nice and straight. I wasn't sure how it was going to go with this shape, but no warping. Going to get my other kiln preheated for the tempering cycles. This one's pretty simple. It's 80 CRV2 steel, so nothing super fancy here. Just going to do a 400 degree temper, 2 hours for 2 cycles with a cool down in between. After all of our tempering cycles, it's time to do some of our grinding. I'm going to take my carbide scribe that I made here. It's just a block of aluminum, little piece of steel rod that I threaded to be able to take a carbide insert for a wood lathe. Just scribe on my lines so I have something good to reference when I'm grinding. That way, again, everything stays extra symmetrical. And then I'll do the same thing for the center line of the edge. That way everything stays nice and straight and I get the thickness at the edge that I'm looking for. And as you can kind of see there, that double line slightly spaced apart is going to help me get my edge thickness. I'm going to use this machinist square to help me align my file guide square to the edge. I want really perpendicular kind of square lines for this. And again, I think that really helps make the dagger point look the best. So I'm taking kind of all the extra little steps to make this thing look perfect. Over on the grinder, now I'm going to do what I call setting the edge. You can see I'm grinding at a pretty steep angle. I usually do about a 45-degree angle to the platen, and all I'm worried about here is grinding perfectly to those lines that I scribed on the edge. This is getting it straight and also getting the thickness that I want. You can see here what that'll look like before I start grinding the bevels. Again, all I'm worried about is that edge. Then I'll come back in at more like a 20-degree angle this time, and I'm going to kind of work to the edge and then slowly start bringing the bevel down to those scribe lines that I made. I'm not really pushing very hard. I'm really focusing on trying to keep everything in a line and square and grinding evenly as I go. That way I don't get off on the dagger point and I keep really crisp, straight lines. Up until now, I've been using a 36 grit belt, so I'm going to swap over to my 60 grit belt and start working my way up the grits. You can see here I'm about 3/16 or so from that scribe line. I don't want to go too close with my lower grit belts, otherwise I'm going to go way past that line by the time I get up to whatever finish grit I want. So then I'll just keep working closer to those lines, keeping even pressure as I go. And now, since I have the edge set, most of my pressure is kind of towards that middle of the blade, the bottom part. I'm not pushing towards the edge very much, otherwise this will get too thin by the time I'm done grinding. After the 60 grit, I move up to my 80 grit. I know it's not a very big jump, and a lot of people will tend to kind of double their grit as they go along. But when you're on these lower grits and you've got really big scratch lines, you'd be surprised how much wear and tear on your belts you save by making those smaller jumps. Once you get up higher, it makes a little more sense. But low down, you're actually going to save a lot of belt life. After the 80, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to a 120 grit belt. I like to use the ceramics as much as possible, mainly because I work all my grinding with hardened steel. Using aluminum oxide belts on hardened steel, it just shreds them right up. So these ceramics last a lot longer. Yes, they're a little more expensive, but it's a good investment for me. I can get a lot of life out of these. After just taking my time, I've got the bevels all done on this, and as you can see, it's really symmetrical, which I was really worried about. I have not tried a dagger point in years, and the last one I tried did not go well. I really took my time on this and made sure that I took the time to do layout and squared everything up, and I think that's why I was successful on this one. Next thing I need to do is square up at the ricasso so that I can get a good fit up when I go to make the guard. Again, kind of the same principle here. I'm going to use my file guide and my machinist square to get everything nice and squared up. I'm using a ceramic belt here to kind of get the bulk of the material off, but I will actually switch over to aluminum oxide when I want to do that final fit, because believe it or not, the ceramic belts can actually score up your carbide a little bit. It won't completely chew them up, but I'm trying to save some tool life. Last thing I need to do on the blade before I move over to the guard is clean up the inside of that center slot. I'm going to use my rotary flex shaft for this and some rubber abrasive bits. Think of these essentially like an eraser that they put some sanding grit inside of. They work really great for polishing in small areas, and I don't have to hand sand forever. I'm also using my digital microscope for this, not really because I have to for this procedure. I could easily do this without, but this thing kind of takes some practice to get used to, and this is a good area where I can kind of play around with it and not worry too much about screwing something up. Plus, it really kind of helps me look in there and see those small scratch lines so that I can get them out without having to do any hand sanding. So that's as far as I'm going to go on this right now. Basically just some finishing, surface finish type stuff from here out. So once I have the guard and everything else fit up the way I want it to, then I'll do the final finish on it, but it's 95% done at this point. Really cool how it came out. I haven't attempted anything like this ever, so pretty happy with it. That dagger point came out really nice and clean, which this is the part I was really concerned about. Not sure how it was going to turn out. So next part, we're going to make the guard, and that part's going to be tricky, but also I'm really excited about that because I think that's going to be one of the coolest parts of this. So like and subscribe. Check out the next part when it comes out. Take me a little while to get to that finish. It's kind of a big piece, a lot going into it, but please follow along. I'm pretty excited about this build, and we'll see you on the next one.